Hey guys, tonight we begin with the disastrous legacies and questionable parenting skills of some of the worst fathers in medieval history. Men who, by all accounts, should have come with warning labels. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might know King John as the villain in every Robin Hood story ever told. But what you may not know is that he was also a world-class contender for least emotionally available father of the 13th century. And that's saying something in an era where parenting was mostly yelling and arranging strategic marriages before your kid hit puberty. John ascended the English throne in 1199, and within weeks he managed to alienate pretty much everyone. Barons, nobles, the Pope, his own mother, and eventually his own children. His legacy as a father is a perfect mix of neglect, selfishness, and the occasional felony homicide. Let's start with the charming story of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur had a claim to the throne, and unfortunately, John had a claim to rage. So he captured the teenager and, allegedly, starved him to death in a castle dungeon. Parenting tip: if your solution to family rivalry involves medieval torture, you've probably crossed a line. But John didn't reserve his dysfunction for extended family. His own son, Henry III, inherited a realm so financially broken and politically unstable that it was basically the medieval version of a flaming trash cart. And to make things worse, John imprisoned Henry's mother, his own wife, for nearly a decade. Because nothing says domestic stability like locking up the mother of your heir in a tower while you lose wars. He taxed the nobles into open rebellion, lost most of his French territories in a single tantrum disguised as a campaign, and eventually got forced to sign the Magna Carta, which he immediately ignored, because rules are for peasants. To the outside world, John was a tyrant. But to his children, he was an absentee landlord with a temper and a crown. He wasn't nurturing. He wasn't wise. He was, at best, the medieval equivalent of a dad who misses your birthday because he's off losing Normandy again. So when we say worst dad in medieval history, John sets the tone. He didn't just fail at fatherhood, he weaponized it. Ivan the Terrible wasn't just bad at parenting. He set the bar so low it tunneled under the foundations of Russian history. Ruling as the first Tsar of all Russia in the 16th century, Ivan started his reign with ambition, reform, and decent PR. But by the time his children were old enough to talk, he had already entered his paranoid tyrant phase. It involved mass executions, secret police, and what modern experts would gently describe as deep trust issues. He fathered several children, but his relationship with his eldest son, also named Ivan, was the kind of disaster that makes modern therapy bills look like charity. The two had a famously tense relationship. The younger Ivan was smart, competent, and popular, which, in Ivan the Terrible's book, translated to deeply suspicious. Things came to a literal head in 1581, when father and son got into a heated argument. The reason? Ivan the Terrible had violently attacked his pregnant daughter-in-law, the younger Ivan's wife, for wearing inappropriate clothing, aka existing without his royal permission. The younger Ivan confronted him. Words were exchanged, voices raised. Then, in true overkill fashion, the elder Ivan struck his son across the head with his scepter in a fit of rage. His son fell, bleeding, dying. There's even a painting of the moment. Ivan cradling his son's lifeless body, wide-eyed in horror, finally realizing that maybe yelling less and not hitting your children with a metal rod might have been a better move. This was not just the death of a son. It was the death of Ivan's political future. His remaining heirs were weak and unfit to rule, setting the stage for the time of troubles, which is as fun as it sounds. Russia descended into chaos, famine, and succession crises, all because Dad couldn't keep his temper in check. Ivan's guilt didn't make him a better father. If anything, it made him worse. He doubled down on executions, imprisonments, and general psychopathy until his own death in 1584, which came, fittingly, while he was playing a game of chess. Probably cheating. In the medieval dad rankings, Ivan gets full points for drama, 0 for nurture, and a Lifetime Achievement Award in royal overreaction. Peter of Castile, also known as Pedro the Cruel, or, if you're feeling extra diplomatic, Pedro the Just, was the kind of medieval father who made sure his kids learned 2 lessons early. 1. Don't trust anyone, and 2. Your dad might literally stab your uncle over dessert. Peter ruled Castile in the mid-14th century, a time when royal family reunions were already tense without the added complication of surprise executions. He came to power as a teenager and quickly developed a reputation for mixing cold political calculation with impulsive bloodshed. Basically, imagine if your dad was both a chess master and a chainsaw. His parenting style? Let's call it low affection, high body count. Peter had numerous children by multiple mistresses, which, for a medieval king, was like collecting Pokemon. Expected, vaguely impressive, and ultimately not that useful if you couldn't remember their names. The problem was, Peter didn't treat them like heirs. He treated them like political scratch-offs. Maybe you'll get a treaty, maybe you'll get a dagger. His greatest contribution to bad parenting, though, was his relentless obsession with destroying his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. Instead of doing what most medieval dads did, ignore their siblings and drink, Peter opted for war. Actual war. He blamed Henry for treason, conspiracies, and the general misalignment of the stars. And he didn't stop at petty insults. In a real family dinner gone wrong moment, Peter personally stabbed another half-brother, Fadrique, during a staged reconciliation. Let's hug it out apparently meant, let me hug you, with a sword. So where does this leave his kids, scattered, disinherited, or imprisoned? Some were declared illegitimate, others were married off like unwanted fruit baskets. One was even tossed into prison by Peter's enemies after Peter's death, just to keep the tradition of generational trauma going strong. None of them got the throne. That went to his arch-enemy and half-brother Henry, the one Peter spent his life trying to kill. Poetic? Yes. Avoidable? Also yes. Peter didn't just fail as a father. He turned fatherhood into a blood sport. Emperor Basil I had one of those glow-up stories that sounds inspiring until you realise it ends in multiple stabbings and a deeply confusing family tree. Born a peasant in 9th century Macedonia, Basil rose through the Byzantine ranks thanks to a mix of charisma, physical strength, and the occasional suspicious disappearance of his rivals. At first, it seems like a rags-to-riches story. Stable boy to emperor. But somewhere along the way, Basil read the parenting manual upside down and decided that emotional bonding was optional, and assassination was just advanced family planning. Let's start with his rise. Basil cozied up to Emperor Michael III, allegedly becoming his wrestling partner, bodyguard, and possibly his lover. History gets a little blurry there. Michael eventually made Basil co-emperor, which was generous, if not fatally optimistic, because shortly after, Basil returned the favour by murdering Michael in his sleep and taking full control of the empire. Now, this alone doesn't make him a bad dad. That comes later, with Leo VI, Basil's supposed son. And I say supposed, because Basil never quite believed it. Leo was born while Empress Eudokia was still very close with Michael III, which led Basil to do what any paranoid emperor would do, raise the boy with a toxic mix of suspicion, rage, and emotional detachment so thick it could be used to build fortresses. Basil constantly undermined Leo, publicly questioned his legitimacy, and basically made every father-son interaction feel like a live episode of Who's the Real Dad? Medieval edition. When Leo tried to study philosophy, Basil banned books. When Leo showed signs of leadership, Basil responded by imprisoning his friends and treating him like a political threat, instead of, his child. And then, to top it all off, Basil had Leo's closest advisor tortured just to send a message. That message being, "I am deeply unwell and should not have children." By the time Basil died in a freak hunting accident involving a stag and a servant's belt, yes, really, Leo reportedly mourned with all the enthusiasm of someone attending a tax seminar. Basil the First. Excellent climber. Terrible dad. He built an empire, but couldn't build a functioning relationship with his own son. Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, not for his personality but for his cheekbones, ruled in the late 13th and early 14th century. And if there's one thing historians agree on, it's that Philip's parenting style made a stone wall look emotionally available. Philip was calculated, intense, and famously silent. His court was cold, disciplined, and efficient, like an early prototype for a corporate office where hugs were strictly prohibited and birthday cards were punishable by exile. He had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, and while he technically provided them with crowns, castles, and tutors, affection was less common. Think HR performance review energy, but with royal titles. But Philip's true claim to terrible dad fame lies in what became known as the Tour de Nesle affair, a scandal so messy it nearly tore the Capetian dynasty apart. Here's how it went. Philip's only daughter, Isabella, the future she-wolf of France, married Edward II of England and paid a visit home. During her stay, she noticed that 2 of her sisters-in-law, married to Philip's sons, seemed to be spending a little too much time with 2 knights from the same castle. Gossip turned into surveillance. Purses were swapped. Hairnets were found in the wrong bedroom. Isabella snitched. Philip acted. And when I say acted, I mean medieval CSI. He had the women arrested, their lovers tortured until they confessed, and the knights executed in a particularly graphic and public way. The princesses were imprisoned, permanently. One died in captivity. Another may have been quietly murdered. And the sons? Well, Philip publicly shamed their wives, but didn't exactly give his boys a pass either. The scandal undermined the royal image, and Philip's response was to basically shut down emotionally and go back to micromanaging his coinage reforms. He never rebuilt trust with his family, never mended the broken marriages. He just tightened control and glared harder. Classic Philip. In the end, all 3 of his sons became kings, briefly and mostly disastrously. It turns out that when you raise your heirs in a loveless royal icebox, they don't exactly flourish. Charles VI of France started out with every intention of being a good king. He was handsome, athletic, and well-liked. People called him Charles the Beloved. Unfortunately, halfway through his reign, the nickname changed to Charles the Mad. And for once, medieval nicknames weren't exaggerating. It began with small things: memory lapses, paranoia, the occasional screaming episode. Then came the infamous incident in 1392, when Charles suddenly turned on his own knights during a march and tried to murder them in the forest. He killed several men before being restrained, which was probably not the team-building exercise they'd hoped for. From there, things spiraled. Charles began experiencing full mental breaks. At one point, he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He forgot his own name, his position, and, most relevantly, that he had children. Yes, Charles had 12 of them, but during his episodes he often didn't recognize them, or his wife, or the throne. For weeks or even months, he lived in a fog of delusion while France crumbled around him. Now, mental illness isn't inherently a crime, and Charles obviously suffered. But what earns him a spot in the medieval Bad Dad Hall of Fame is what his breakdown did to his kids. With their father unfit to rule, and their mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, constantly scrambling to keep the court functional, Charles's children became pawns in one of the ugliest power struggles in French history. Factions at court fought over who should control the king, and by extension, his children. His sons were shuffled around like royal luggage. His daughters were married off in desperate political alliances. One son, the future Charles VII, grew up surrounded by betrayal, humiliation, and English armies, and his father offered nothing but catatonic silence. By the time Charles VI died in 1422, France was in the middle of the 100 Years' War. Half the kingdom was occupied, and his son was fighting for legitimacy in a country that barely remembered what a stable monarchy looked like. Charles didn't intend to be a bad father, but his madness, denial, and absence left a vacuum, and his children grew up in the shadows of chaos. Sometimes the worst dad isn't the cruel one. Sometimes it's the one who's simply not there. Edward I of England, also known as Longshanks, was the kind of dad who believed in discipline, conquest, and absolutely zero hugs. He was tall, commanding, and terrifying in the way that only a medieval king with a temper and a sharp sword could be. He's famous for two things: building castles and breaking nations. He conquered Wales, waged war on Scotland, expelled the Jews from England, and probably kicked over your ancestors' favourite bucket just for looking at him sideways. But his greatest challenge wasn't on a battlefield, it was in the nursery. Enter his son, the future Edward II. Now, Edward II was everything Edward I was not: sensitive, artistic, emotionally expressive. He preferred music and poetry over military drills. He showed a concerning lack of interest in invading things. And worst of all, he surrounded himself with male companions that the court, and his father, did not approve of. This clash of personalities was a disaster waiting to happen. Edward I didn't just disapprove of his son's lifestyle, he was horrified. He frequently threatened to disinherit him. When Edward II refused to abandon his favourite companion, Piers Gaveston, his father exiled Gaveston and openly questioned whether his son was fit to rule. Imagine a father-son talk where the father brings an army. In public, Edward I humiliated his son. In private, he likely terrified him. There's no record of heartfelt letters or meaningful bonding moments. Their version of quality time was sitting at opposite ends of a war council glaring at each other. And when Edward I was dying in 1307, his final instructions weren't sentimental, they were militant. He ordered his bones to be carried into battle against the Scots if the war continued. You know, normal dad stuff. After his death, Edward II took the throne, and promptly did everything his father would have hated. He brought Gaveston back, mismanaged the kingdom, and eventually got overthrown by his own wife and her lover. The bar was low, and he still tripped over it. John of Bohemia was many things: a king, a knight, a crusader, and, unfortunately for his children, an adrenaline junkie with a crown. Born in the early 14th century, John was one of those medieval dads who thought parenting meant leaving your kids a shiny title and several active war zones. He became King of Bohemia in 1310, married into power, and had multiple children, including his most famous son, Charles IV, future Holy Roman Emperor. And it's a miracle Charles turned out functional, because growing up under John of Bohemia was like being raised by a particularly aggressive game of Risk. John spent most of his life not in Bohemia. In fact, he barely bothered with it at all. He preferred galloping across Europe on various military campaigns, sometimes for honour, sometimes for politics, and occasionally just because it was Tuesday. He pawned off his governing duties and his children, leaving young Charles to be raised by strangers, while John jousted his way through France, Italy, and the Low Countries. As a father, he was distant. As a role model, he was, maybe don't do that. But nothing sums up John's parenting legacy like his grand finale at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. By then, John was completely blind. Not metaphorically, actually blind. Most people would see this as a good excuse to retire. John saw it as the perfect opportunity to charge into battle on horseback, tied between two other knights, so he could ride in one final blaze of glory. And he did. Right into a wall of English arrows. He died, obviously. But not before becoming a chivalric legend. And also, leaving his teenage son to inherit a war-torn throne with zero preparation, no paternal guidance, and a legacy to live up to that literally included blind horse combat. John's idea of fatherhood was simple. Make bold moves, ignore your children, and die in a way that guarantees you'll be quoted by poets but cursed by your heirs. Charles IV would later become one of the most effective rulers in European history, which is even more impressive when you realise he had to unlearn everything his father never taught him. William the Conqueror is best known for winning the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and turning England into his personal renovation project. But while he was busy rewriting British history, he also managed to write one of the more dysfunctional chapters in medieval fatherhood. Born illegitimate, the son of a duke and a woman politely described as not his wife, William rose to power the hard way, through war, intimidation, and a deeply repressed sense of affection. He didn't hug. He conquered. He had at least 9 children with his wife Matilda, including 4 sons who all, at some point, wanted to be king. Unfortunately, William only had one throne and an intense inability to communicate without shouting. His heir, Robert Curthose, a nickname that roughly translates to short pants, which is probably not how you want to be remembered, was the eldest son and expected to inherit Normandy. William, however, had reservations, possibly because Robert was impulsive, arrogant, and once started a street brawl with his own brothers. Classic sibling bonding. Robert eventually demanded more power. William said no. Robert rebelled. William laid siege to the castle his son was hiding in. Yes, he besieged his own child. The medieval version of grounding your kid with trebuchets. During one battle, Robert even unhorsed his father and wounded him, before realising who it was. William's reaction? Absolute fury. Not because of the injury, but because being knocked off your horse by your own son was, frankly, embarrassing. He eventually forgave Robert, but never quite trusted him again. Instead, William divided his lands awkwardly, Normandy to Robert, England to his second son William Rufus, and everyone else got some lands and emotional scars. The division sparked decades of civil war, brother-on-brother fighting, and at least one royal murder mystery. William's inability to manage his sons, or teach them how to rule without using swords, left a legacy of chaos that outlived him by generations. In short, William the Conqueror built a kingdom but forgot to build a functioning family. His children inherited crowns, castles, and the unresolved rage of a dad who parented like he was still on a battlefield. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, spent his entire life trying to live up to his name, and as far as names go, Bold doesn't exactly encourage subtle parenting. If anything, it demands drama, and Charles delivered, repeatedly, at full volume. Born in 1433, Charles inherited the wealthy and powerful Duchy of Burgundy from his father, Philip the Good, who, as his name suggests, was fairly competent and gave Charles an enormous inheritance. Armies, cities, political alliances, and, unfortunately, expectations. Charles had one daughter, Mary of Burgundy, and his approach to fatherhood was something between chessmaster and medieval helicopter parent. He had no sons, which gave him anxiety, and he poured all of his dynastic hopes into Mary like she was a medieval spreadsheet with legs. Instead of preparing her for rule, Charles focused on expanding the Burgundian state by starting fights with just about everyone. France, the Swiss, the Holy Roman Empire. If they had a border, he wanted to push past it. He believed he could carve out a shiny new kingdom for himself, with Mary waiting politely on the sidelines to inherit it. Spoiler: this plan went up in flames. Charles was bold, yes, but also reckless. He fought battles he didn't need to fight, insulted allies and underestimated every enemy he had. His final years were a non-stop war tour, ending in the spectacular disaster of the Battle of Nancy in 1477, where Charles charged headfirst into the Swiss army and was killed. His body was found days later, frozen in the snow, half-eaten by wolves, which historians agree is never a great postscript for your parenting resume. The real tragedy? Mary, only 19, was left to clean up the mess. With no preparation, no solid alliances, and every major European power now circling like vultures, she was forced to marry into the Habsburg dynasty to survive, a move that changed the course of European history and made Burgundy a battlefield for centuries. Charles the Bold didn't leave his daughter a legacy. He left her a smoking diplomatic crater and an army of enemies. He wanted to be remembered as a king. Instead, he's remembered as a cautionary tale, and possibly wolf food. If Alfonso XI of Castile had been alive today, he'd have his own reality show, something like Keeping Up with the Illegitimates, or The Royal Bachelor, Iberian edition. Ruling in the first half of the 14th century, Alfonso was a skilled military leader who spent much of his reign fighting off Muslim forces in the Reconquista. On the battlefield, he was decisive and effective. At home, however, he was decisively disastrous as a father, especially if your name wasn't Leonor of Guzman. Let's explain. Alfonso married Maria of Portugal, a proper royal match designed to keep Iberian alliances clean and politically efficient. But Alfonso had zero interest in his wife. He had another woman in mind, Leonor of Guzman, a noble woman who quickly became his mistress, his confidant, and, eventually, the mother of 10 of his children. 10, not 2, not 4, 10. He was building his own soccer team on the side. These were not hidden children either. Alfonso flaunted them at court. He gave them titles. He gave Leonor estates. He treated the whole thing like a medieval Instagram feed. Here's me with my mistress. Here's me promoting her sons. Here's my actual queen sulking in the background. Maria, understandably, did not appreciate this. The real problem came after Alfonso's sudden death from the Black Death in 1350. His legitimate son with Maria, Peter I of Castile, later known as Peter the Cruel, spoiler alert, became king at the age of 15 and was furious about his father's favoritism. His first major act? Avenging his mother. Peter had Leonor of Guzman arrested and later executed. Not politely, not discreetly. It was brutal and public. The civil war between Peter's supporters and the children of Leonor, his half-brothers, raged for years. All thanks to Dad's inability to keep family and statecraft in separate bedrooms. Alfonso XI wasn't abusive or absent. He was excessively present in the wrong places. He loved his mistress, adored his illegitimate sons, and left his actual heir with nothing but resentment and a civil war waiting to happen. A strong king, yes, but as a father. Alfonso gets full points for reproduction, 0 for judgment, and a lifetime subscription to medieval family drama. Richard the Lionheart is one of those kings who got way more press than parenting time. Crowned King of England in 1189, he became a living legend for his role in the Third Crusade, all muscle, swordplay, and dramatic poses on horseback. Unfortunately, while Richard was out winning glory in the Holy Land, he also won himself a spot on the list of worst medieval dads, mainly by not even trying. Now technically, Richard never had any legitimate children, which some might say disqualifies him. But let's pause here. Having 0 legitimate kids was his decision. He was married to Berengaria of Navarre for years. They even spent a few days in the same room. But he showed roughly the same interest in her as he did in growing vegetables, distant, theoretical, and completely unwatered. He did have at least one illegitimate son, Philip of Cognac, whom he barely acknowledged and then conveniently forgot when it came to inheritance. A royal son with no lands, no titles, and no public recognition. Welcome to Richard's brand of fatherhood, absentee with a side of awkward silence. But let's say you count his role as uncle, brother, and son. Even there, Richard was a master of betrayal. He rebelled against his father, Henry II, tried to outmaneuver his brothers, and left the English treasury so drained by crusade spending and ransom payments that his brother John had to squeeze the peasants dry just to keep the lights on. In fact, while Richard spent only about 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England, he did manage to drag the entire kingdom into his personal military fantasies. He may not have raised children, but he treated the nation like one, spoiled, ignored, and left to clean up after his messes. Philip of Cognac, his illegitimate son, disappears from history not long after Richard's death. No title, no land, no mention. Just another royal shadow forgotten by a father too busy being immortalised in tapestries. So yes, Richard could lead armies, inspire legends, and pose on coins like a god. But as a father, he couldn't even be bothered to write a will. If you combined Machiavelli with an overbearing helicopter parent and gave him a crown, you'd get Louis XI of France, a man so paranoid he preferred sending letters by carrier pigeon because he didn't trust human messengers. You know, perfectly normal dad energy. Louis ruled in the 15th century and is best known for turning France into a centralised bureaucratic machine run by spies, bribes and threats whispered behind closed doors. He wore plain clothes to seem modest, but don't be fooled. He was pulling every string in the kingdom like a royal puppeteer with trust issues. Now Louis only had one son who survived into adulthood, the future Charles VIII. And let's just say their relationship was less father and son and more warden and hostage. Louis XI feared that Charles would one day challenge his authority. So what did he do? Encourage him? Prepare him for leadership? Of course not. He isolated him. Charles was raised away from court, kept under constant supervision, and given just enough education to read royal decrees, but not enough to write his own. Louis didn't want a successor. He wanted a puppet, one that wouldn't ask too many questions. He forbade Charles from making any political decisions and frequently changed his household staff, just in case they got too friendly. At one point, Louis even considered disinheriting him entirely, just for talking back. You know, classic family bonding. And when Louis got sick, he still refused to give Charles any real authority. Instead, he tried to govern from his deathbed using a combination of letters, rumours, and desperate micromanagement. Even as he lay dying, Louis was more focused on controlling his legacy than comforting his terrified, unprepared teenage heir. By the time Charles VIII finally took the throne in 1483, he was a sheltered 18-year-old with no clue how to run a kingdom, which led directly to some of the worst military and political decisions in early modern France. Louis XI ruled through manipulation, secrecy, and sheer paranoia. As a king, he was clever. As a father, he was emotionally unavailable, pathologically suspicious, and the human version of a locked door. Charles II of England was known as the Merry Monarch, which sounds delightful until you realise it mainly refers to how much time he spent drinking, gambling, and enthusiastically ignoring anything that resembled responsibility, including fatherhood. When Charles returned to the English throne in 1660 after years in exile, and a rather unfortunate detour known as the English Civil War, the country was tired of Puritanism. So Charles brought the party back. Theatres reopened, wigs got taller, and court life became one long royal after-party. And Charles? Charles got busy. Not with governing, with producing children. Despite being married to Queen Catherine of Braganza, Charles never had any legitimate heirs. But that didn't stop him from becoming one of the most prolific baby makers in British royal history. He acknowledged at least 12 illegitimate children from 7 different mistresses, including actresses, duchesses, and one woman who once dressed up as a milkmaid to seduce him, because that was a thing, apparently. But acknowledging them is where his parenting largely ended. He gave them titles, Duke of this, Earl of that, and lavish allowances, then promptly left them to be raised by their mothers or well-paid nannies. Charles treated fatherhood like a real estate portfolio. Diversify, name them something fancy, and check in once a year if they don't cause a scandal. He was known to joke, "I am the father of my people," and of many more. And he wasn't wrong. His sons and daughters populated European courts, stirred up dynastic tensions, and, in at least one case, launched a rebellion. That would be James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, Charles's illegitimate son who decided he deserved the crown and ended up with his head on a spike. Father-son bonding, royal edition. Charles never really mentored his children or prepared them for much beyond lavish titles and awkward paternity footnotes. His legacy as a father was a cocktail of charm, irresponsibility, and vague aristocratic smirking. He ruled during a time of recovery, scandal, and excess, and his parenting style was exactly that: excessive, decorative, and deeply avoidant. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he embodied it. Known as the Sun King, he turned himself into a living deity in silk heels, shining at the centre of Europe while everyone else orbited him carefully, nervously, and preferably with powdered wigs. He reigned for 72 years, making him the longest reigning monarch in European history. That's a lot of time to build an empire, micromanage nobility, and, most relevant here, mess up your kids. Louis had one legitimate son, the Grand Dauphin, and at least 16 illegitimate children by various mistresses. He later legitimized many of them, because why not hand out nobility like party favours? Now, Louis wasn't an absent father. He was omnipresent. He hovered. He controlled everything. Think less Dad reading you bedtime stories, and more Dad assigning you your political alliances before your voice changes. The Grand Dauphin, Louis's only legitimate male heir, grew up in the most luxurious prison imaginable, Versailles, surrounded by marble, fountains, and spies. Louis didn't trust him with any real power, which is awkward when your job is literally next king. Every time the Dauphin tried to assert himself, Louis would gently remind him who the actual son in the room was, by undermining his decisions, stalling his education, or just flat out ignoring his advice. The Dauphin never ruled. He died before his father, as did the Dauphin's son, and his son. That's right, Louis XIV outlived 3 generations of heirs, partly because he insisted on bottling power so tightly that his family line suffered from emotional anemia. Meanwhile, Louis's legitimized children weren't exactly raised to challenge him. They were dressed up, paraded around, and used to marry into key noble houses, strategic pawns in silk shoes. Some of them were given absurd amounts of prestige, others faded into the background. None were allowed to outshine him, and most never dared to try. Louis wasn't violent or negligent. He was worse, suffocatingly sovereign. He raised sons and grandsons who bowed before him their entire lives, and had no idea what to do once he was gone. Long before satellites, Doppler radar, or hourly forecasts on your phone, the ancient Babylonians were already peering into the skies for answers. And not just out of idle curiosity. For them, predicting the weather wasn't a luxury, it was a matter of life and death. Crops, harvests, irrigation, and the very survival of cities along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers depended on how well these ancient people could read the signs of the heavens. Babylonian priests, known as Baru, took on the role of proto-meteorologists. But their weather app was the open sky, and their data was written in clay, literally. Thousands of cuneiform tablets unearthed from the ruins of cities like Nineveh and Babylon contain weather omens, sky patterns, and long-term observations passed down across generations. These weren't vague horoscopes either. These people catalogued what happened when clouds formed a certain way, or when lightning struck on a particular day of the month. A cloud forming in the west? That might mean a flood is coming. Thunder heard from the north? A sign of war? Red skies at dusk? Likely divine wrath, or at least a warning to prepare for crop failure. If a crescent moon glowed too brightly, it wasn't just pretty, it meant something serious, and the priests would consult older omens to decide what to do. But here's the twist. While it all sounds mystical, a surprising amount of it was based on observation and experience. Over centuries, the Babylonians noticed recurring weather patterns tied to lunar phases, planetary alignments, and solar events. Their weather omens evolved into probabilistic logic. If X happened in the sky, Y usually followed on the ground. And how did they track these phenomena? They climbed massive ziggurats, those iconic temple towers, where the views were unobstructed and ideal for spotting cloud formations, sunsets, lightning patterns, and celestial movements. Imagine standing atop a stone mountain, watching the horizon with trained eyes, looking not just for clouds, but for messages from the gods. To the Babylonians, weather wasn't just natural, it was political, spiritual, and terrifying. If your barley harvest failed because you missed a celestial omen, your people could starve, and your city could fall. The pressure on these skywatchers? Astronomical, literally. And yet, despite being surrounded by myths and gods, they were building something shockingly close to science. In ancient Egypt, the most important weather event wasn't rain or sunshine, it was the annual flooding of the Nile. This flood was no disaster, it was salvation. Without it, crops wouldn't grow, fields would dry up, and famine would knock at the door. But it had to be timed just right. If it came too early, planting would be impossible. Too late, and the growing season would be lost. So how did the Egyptians know when the flood was coming? They looked up, not at clouds, but at stars. Specifically, the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. Every year, just before dawn, Sirius would appear on the eastern horizon, rising just ahead of the sun. To the Egyptians, this wasn't just a beautiful sight, it was a celestial alarm clock. Within days of its appearance, the Nile would begin to swell. They didn't stumble upon this by accident. Egyptian priests, known as hour watchers, had spent centuries tracking Sirius and other stars from their temple observatories. They used tall columns, marked with shadow lines, water clocks, and even small handheld instruments to measure time and stellar positions. Their goal wasn't abstract astronomy, it was agriculture. Lives depended on it. When Sirius rose, it also marked the Egyptian New Year, a sacred time of rebirth tied directly to the inundation. The gods they believed controlled this cosmic order. Sothis, the deified version of Sirius, was associated with Isis, the goddess of life and magic, who wept tears into the Nile, causing the flood. The mythology gave meaning, but the star gave the warning. Even their famous calendar system, based on 365 days, was built around these stellar observations. While other ancient cultures obsessed over the moon, Egyptians focused on solar and sidereal time, which allowed them to predict annual cycles with remarkable accuracy. And when the flood did arrive, it was measured using nilometers, stone columns placed in the river to monitor water levels. If the flood was too low, priests would warn of famine. Too high, and they feared destruction. But when it was just right, pharaohs held festivals, praising the divine order of the heavens. In short, Egypt didn't rely on weather forecasts. They relied on a cosmic dance between stars, gods, and the river that gave them life. To predict the future, they simply waited for Sirius to rise. High in the rugged Andes, where the air is thin and the clouds cling to jagged peaks, ancient Andean farmers faced a brutal reality. Weather determined survival. But without stars clearly visible year-round or sprawling rivers like the Nile, they had to develop their own systems. And surprisingly, some of their most trusted meteorologists had forelegs, fur, and hooves. In the Andean highlands, farmers carefully watched the behavior of llamas, alpacas, and even guinea pigs to detect coming weather shifts. If llamas rolled aggressively or changed their grazing patterns, that could mean a cold snap was on the way. When guinea pigs became more restless than usual, it was sometimes interpreted as a signal of incoming storms. Andean people believed animals, being more attuned to the earth, could sense subtle environmental changes before humans could. But it wasn't just about animals. These communities, especially the Quechua and Aymara peoples, combined animal observation with deep sky law and landscape awareness. For example, they would look to the Yana Fuyu, or black clouds, dark patches in the Milky Way visible during certain seasons. These cloud-like silhouettes weren't made of stars, but of interstellar dust, and Andean sky watchers believed their shapes predicted rainfall. A larger llama shape in the sky meant plentiful water. A distorted or faint one, drought was coming. They also examined the snow lines on nearby mountains. If the snow melted too fast, it could signal a dangerously dry season. If it clung to the peaks longer than usual, it might mean floods. The entire Andean worldview was based on reciprocity with nature. You didn't control the weather, you negotiated with it. Ceremonies and offerings like pagos a la tierra, payments to the earth, were performed to appease the spirits believed to inhabit the weather systems. Timing was everything. Corn and potato planting depended on precise seasonal cues. A few weeks off, and the crops would freeze or rot. To Andean farmers, accuracy meant more than yield. It meant the difference between a full belly and famine. So, while the Babylonians read the clouds and the Egyptians watched stars, the Andean peoples looked at animals, shadows, and sacred mountains. Their tools were different, but the mission was the same: to survive in a world where the skies held your fate and the earth was always whispering, if you knew how to listen. In ancient China, the weather was more than a natural occurrence. It was a reflection of cosmic harmony. The emperor wasn't just a ruler. He was the son of heaven, tasked with maintaining balance between earth and the celestial order. If the skies darkened unexpectedly or drought struck the land, it wasn't just bad luck. It was a sign that something was spiritually out of alignment. The stakes were both agricultural and political. Chinese weather prediction blended natural observation with philosophical cosmology. It all began with the 5 elements theory: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, and the belief that these forces interacted with the yin and yang energies to influence everything, including the weather. A drought wasn't merely a dry spell, it meant an imbalance in the water element. A sudden storm, perhaps an excess of yang energy. But the Chinese didn't just theorize, they observed. Court astronomers and scholars meticulously recorded patterns in wind direction, cloud formations, seasonal temperatures, and rainfall. These records stretch back to at least the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, when oracle bones were used to divine both royal affairs and climate conditions. Tortoise shells were cracked in fires, and the resulting lines were interpreted to predict rainfall or storms. Clouds were especially important. The ancient Chinese categorized them, no, not cumulus or cirrus, but as signs of the celestial dragons. Dragons represented the forces of water and weather, especially rain. A curling, snake-like cloud in the east? That meant good fortune and rain. Red clouds at dusk, on the other hand, were often seen as omens of war or unrest. They even developed early meteorological instruments. By the Han Dynasty, they were using water clocks and rudimentary wind vanes. Later on, the Chinese would invent devices like the seismoscope and early versions of the rain gauge, centuries ahead of their European counterparts. And when things went wrong, when floods wiped out villages or locusts followed droughts, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was an existential crisis for the emperor. These events could trigger revolts, as the people saw them as proof that heaven had withdrawn its mandate. The skies weren't just nature, they were law. So while the Chinese didn't rely on animals or just the stars, they had their own unique system, a marriage of empirical observation, philosophical balance, and dragon cloud poetry. And if you wanted to rule China, you'd better know what the wind was whispering. In ancient Greece, weather prediction began to peel away from the gods and steer towards something we'd recognize today: logic. That doesn't mean the Greeks abandoned divine explanations altogether. Zeus was still flinging thunderbolts. But a handful of thinkers began asking dangerous questions. What if the skies weren't ruled by temperamental gods, but by natural laws? Enter Anaximander, Aristotle, and a cadre of early philosophers who tried to explain weather without divine intervention. Anaximander, one of the earliest, proposed that rain and wind were caused by the sun evaporating moisture from the earth, a concept that wasn't terribly far from reality. Then came Aristotle, who basically wrote the ancient version of a weather textbook. Meteorologica. In Meteorologica, Aristotle didn't just describe clouds or rain. He tried to classify the entire natural world: winds, earthquakes, lightning, even celestial phenomena, based on observable patterns. He argued that air, water, earth, and fire combined in different ways to create storms, snow, and heat waves. Sure, some of it was wrong. He thought comets were dry exhalations that caught fire, but the effort itself was revolutionary. Greek farmers, meanwhile, didn't wait for Aristotle's lectures to finish before planting their olives. They relied on calendar-based knowledge, passed down through generations. One famous example is the Works and Days by Hesiod, a poetic farming manual written around 700 BCE. It told farmers when to plant, when to harvest, and what signs to watch for. If cranes were migrating south, winter was near. If Orion rose early in the morning, it was time to prune vines. The Greeks also paid close attention to wind patterns, especially sailors. The Etesian winds, regular summer winds in the Aegean, were predictable enough to plan voyages. Harbours, trade routes, and even temples were built with these patterns in mind. This kind of empirical, experience-based knowledge coexisted with more philosophical speculation. And yes, omens still played a role, particularly among rural folk. A howling dog at night or a moon ring could still send shivers down a farmer's spine. But compared to their neighbours, the Greeks made a bold leap. They believed nature could be studied, not just worshipped. In ancient India, predicting the weather was less about scanning clouds and more about understanding vast cyclical forces. The subcontinent's agriculture depended heavily on one thing: the monsoon. If it arrived late or brought too little rain, crops would fail. If it came too early or with too much intensity, floods would destroy entire villages. This delicate balance gave birth to one of the most detailed early systems of seasonal prediction. The earliest weather lore in India comes from the Vedas, sacred texts composed over 3,000 years ago. These hymns, chants, and rituals didn't just praise the gods. They encoded generations of observational knowledge. One of the most important deities was Indra, god of storms and rain, who rode the clouds and released monsoon torrents with his thunderbolt. When Indra was pleased, the rains came. When he was angry, droughts followed. But the Vedic seers weren't passive worshippers. They were also keen observers of seasonal cycles, or ritus. The Indian year was divided into 6 ritus, each tied to specific atmospheric changes. Farmers learned to associate certain blooms, bird migrations, and insect patterns with the approach of monsoon rains. For example, if the Kartak flower bloomed early, it meant heavy rains were likely. If frogs croaked more often at night, farmers took it as a reliable sign that the wet season was close. The ancient Siddhantic texts, which came later, incorporated even more rigorous astronomical frameworks. Scholars like Varahamihira, writing in the 6th century CE, compiled manuals that blended astrology, star movements, and environmental cues to forecast weather events. In his work Brihatsamhita, Varahamihira outlined over 100 indicators for predicting rain, ranging from the colour of the sky at sunrise to the movements of snakes and ants. These weren't vague predictions either. Monsoon forecasting involved solar and lunar calendars, the study of planetary conjunctions, and long-term sky watching to find patterns. The goal wasn't just to understand the weather, but to live in harmony with it. Agriculture, temple construction, festivals, and even royal decisions were often timed with these seasonal insights. Across the vast and varied landscapes of North America, indigenous peoples developed deeply localized systems of weather prediction long before any European settler brought a barometer. From the Arctic tundra to the plains, deserts, and coastal forests, Native American tribes tuned into the environment with extraordinary precision. Because when you live off the land, forecasting is survival. There was no single uniform system across tribes, of course. Each community responded to its specific environment. For the plains tribes, like the Lakota or Blackfoot, watching the behavior of buffalo herds was a key indicator. If the animals clustered tightly or changed grazing routes suddenly, A storm was believed to be imminent. In some cases, the way birds flew, particularly geese, hawks, or ravens, was used to predict seasonal shifts. A low, fast flight often meant a storm was approaching. A high, meandering flight, fair weather. The Hopi of the American Southwest, living in one of the driest regions on the continent, relied on both astronomy and animal behavior. The sighting of certain insects, like ants building unusually tall mounds, indicated upcoming rain. The Hopi calendar was also guided by the rising of key constellations. The appearance of the Pleiades at dawn signaled the time for planting corn. Like the Egyptians with Sirius, the Hopi used the heavens to guide agriculture. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit and Haida watched the sea. The colour of the water, the movement of schools of fish, and even the texture of morning fog were all pieces of a natural puzzle. Whales appearing earlier in the season than usual? A harsh winter might be on the way. Salmon running late? A dry summer was likely. Some tribes went beyond mere observation and practiced ritual forecasting, blending spiritual traditions with environmental awareness. In some Iroquois communities, special weather songs were sung to honor the spirit of thunder, while Cherokee shamans interpreted cloud shapes during sacred ceremonies to determine the next planting period. What united all these approaches was intimacy with nature. This wasn't weather prediction in the modern scientific sense, it was weather relationship. Observation wasn't separate from belief. It was part of a reciprocal worldview where humans, animals, and the sky were all family. Far from any continent scattered across the vast Pacific, the ancient Polynesians developed one of the most astonishing systems of environmental navigation and weather forecasting the world has ever seen. These seafaring people didn't just predict weather for farming. They did it while sailing thousands of miles in open canoes, with no instruments, no maps, and no written language. How did they survive? They read the ocean like a book. Polynesian navigators, or wayfinders, trained from childhood to notice subtle changes in wind patterns, wave refraction, cloud formations, and even the flight paths of seabirds. A skilled navigator could tell a storm was coming, not from thunderheads or dark skies, but from how the swells under the boat shifted slightly in rhythm. A sudden change in the scent of the air or the colour of the horizon might mean a squall was approaching. Clouds were also crucial. Certain types of clouds, like cumulus clouds that formed over islands during the day, were used not just for locating land, but for anticipating local weather. If the cloud had a sharp vertical shape in the morning, it might mean clear skies. If it flattened and darkened toward evening, rain and rough seas could follow. And then there were the stars. Polynesians didn't just stargaze for beauty, they memorized the entire celestial sphere, learning dozens of star paths that helped them judge their location and orientation. But those same stars also gave hints about the seasons. When Antares rose just before dawn, it signaled the approach of the cyclone season in parts of the South Pacific. Star risings and settings were carefully correlated with wind shifts and rainfall patterns. Their knowledge wasn't written, it was embedded in chants, songs, and oral stories. Learning to navigate was less about formulas and more about absorbing patterns, repeating them until they became second nature. These living maps included weather signs as part of the route. Even ocean colour was a cue. A sudden shift from deep blue to greenish water might signal a coral reef or shallows, but also warmer currents and increased storm potential. Every detail mattered. Every change in nature was a message. As modern humans scroll through weather apps and glance at satellite images before stepping outside, it's easy to forget that for most of history, the weather wasn't predicted. It was felt, observed, and feared. And yet, across the ancient world, from Babylon to the Andes, people managed to build entire systems of survival from what they could read in the skies, the soil, the stars, and even the animals around them. What united all these ancient forecasting traditions was intimacy. Whether it was a Babylonian priest standing atop a ziggurat interpreting thunder, or an Andean farmer watching a llama's behaviour, weather prediction wasn't some distant scientific abstraction. It was personal. It was ancestral. And it was urgent. Modern meteorology, built on physics, data models, and technology, owes a surprising debt to these ancient systems. The Egyptians tied the rising of Sirius to the Nile's flood, essentially discovering a seasonal astronomical trigger. The Chinese tracked wind patterns and categorized cloud types. Indian scholars documented climate behaviors with alarming precision in texts still studied today. Even Aristotle's Meteorologica, despite its flaws, became foundational in Western thought for centuries. But perhaps the most enduring lesson from the ancients isn't about accuracy, it's about attunement. These civilizations didn't just predict the weather, they respected it. They wove it into religion, ritual, poetry, and politics. Weather wasn't just something that happened, it was something that spoke, and that worldview might be worth reclaiming. As we face a modern climate crisis, rising temperatures, erratic rainfall, disappearing seasons, we might do well to borrow a bit of that ancient humility. The Babylonians didn't think they controlled the skies. The Polynesians didn't try to dominate the ocean. They adapted, listened, and treated nature as a partner, not a problem. Today's forecasts can tell us if it'll rain next Thursday, but they can't tell us how to live with the land or how to pass that knowledge down through stories, songs, and signs. The ancients knew something we've largely forgotten, that survival isn't just about knowing the weather, it's about belonging to it. By the year 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was the most powerful man in the Roman world, and possibly the most dangerous. He wasn't born a king, but he acted like one. His meteoric rise from a bankrupt aristocrat to the apex of Roman politics had been paved with cunning, military brilliance, and just the right amount of ruthless charm. His greatest military achievement, the conquest of Gaul, turned him from a popular general into a living war god. For nearly a decade, Caesar had led Roman legions across what is now France, Belgium, and parts of Germany, amassing unimaginable wealth and loyal soldiers who would follow him into the underworld if he asked. When the Senate tried to strip him of command in 49 BCE, Caesar didn't retire quietly. He crossed the Rubicon River, a literal act of treason, and marched on Rome. It was the point of no return. In the ensuing civil war, he crushed his rival Pompey, scattered the Senate's forces, and eventually returned home to Rome, not just as a victor, but as a ruler. He was granted the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, a term that made traditionalists squirm. This wasn't just a temporary emergency measure. This was permanent, and that was a problem. Once back in power, Caesar began to reshape the state. He expanded the Senate, but filled it with loyalists. He reduced debts, restructured the calendar into what would become the Julian system, and offered citizenship to foreigners. He acted quickly and boldly, cutting through the old bureaucracy like a blade. To the common people, he was a hero. To the Senate aristocracy, a warning siren. They watched nervously as Caesar paraded through Rome in a purple toga, a colour reserved for royalty. They grimaced when he sat alone in a golden chair at the front of the Senate. Statues went up. Coins were minted with his face. Priests declared him a living god. At a public festival, Mark Antony even offered him a crown. Caesar refused, but only after dramatic hesitation. To his enemies, the signs were clear. Julius Caesar wasn't just consolidating power, he was laying the groundwork for monarchy. Rome had overthrown kings nearly 5 centuries earlier, and now, with every passing day, it looked like the Republic was about to be reborn as something darker, crowned, and irreversible. While Caesar basked in glory, his enemies were sharpening their knives, figuratively at first, then quite literally. In the marbled halls of Roman villas and the smoky corners of taverns, whispers of discontent turned into concrete plans. To many senators, Caesar's concentration of power wasn't reform, it was tyranny. And tyrants, according to Roman tradition, could be removed. Permanently. The conspiracy didn't spring from the political fringes. It came from the heart of the Roman elite. Leading the charge was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a seasoned general and a bitter opponent of Caesar's centralization. But the real prize for the conspirators was someone far more symbolic: Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was no fringe radical. He was widely respected, famously stoic, and descended from Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had helped expel Rome's last king centuries earlier. If Brutus joined the plot, it would no longer be treason. It would be tradition. At first, Brutus hesitated. Caesar had forgiven him for siding with Pompey during the Civil War, and even treated him like a surrogate son. But that closeness only deepened Brutus's internal conflict. Was loyalty to Caesar more important than loyalty to Rome? Cassius played on that tension skillfully, feeding Brutus flattery, logic, and just enough guilt to tip the scales. By early March, the core conspiracy group had grown to over 60 senators, including men who had previously enjoyed Caesar's favour. Some were driven by ideology, others by personal grudges or fear of losing influence, but they were all united by one belief: Caesar had gone too far, and the Republic could not survive his reign. They began meeting secretly in private homes and temples, debating the method, the moment, and, most importantly, the message. Caesar was set to leave Rome in a few weeks for a campaign in Parthia. If they didn't act soon, they feared he'd never return, or return with more power than ever. The window was closing. A public assassination would be risky, but it would also be symbolic. And what better place than the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate would meet on the Ides of March? March 15th. They chose daggers, not swords. Speed and surprise would be their only advantages. The conspirators were ready. The Republic, they told themselves, would be saved. What they didn't know is that they were about to plunge it into blood, chaos, and civil war. The morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, began like any other, except that Rome itself seemed tense. The air was heavy with rumours. Strange omens had reportedly occurred: storms, ghostly apparitions, and animals acting erratically. According to later accounts, Caesar's own wife, Calpurnia, had nightmares of his murder, and begged him not to go to the Senate meeting that day. For a moment, he actually listened. He stayed home. But fate, or pride, had other plans. One of the conspirators, Decimus Brutus, not to be confused with Marcus, arrived at Caesar's home and persuaded him to reconsider. He assured Caesar that the Senate was ready to bestow more honours, and that skipping the session would seem cowardly or arrogant. Caesar, ever conscious of image, relented. Escorted by a small group, Caesar made his way through the forum and toward the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was temporarily meeting. He was handed a note warning him of the plot, but he never read it. The man was walking into his own funeral, unaware that nearly every senator in the chamber had brought a dagger under his toga. When Caesar entered the Senate chamber, the conspirators sprang into motion. They gathered around him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Lucius Tillius Cimber was the first to strike, grabbing Caesar's toga and pulling it down. That was the signal. The first knife came from Servilius Casca, clumsy and off-target. Caesar reportedly cried, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" Before realizing it wasn't a single attack, it was an ambush. More blades followed. Senators swarmed him, stabbing wildly, hitting not just Caesar, but occasionally each other. The frenzy of violence had begun. In all, Caesar was stabbed 23 times, though only one wound, likely the one to the chest, was fatal. According to legend, he did not resist after seeing Brutus among the attackers. His supposed last words, "Et tu, Brute?" "You too, Brutus?" have become myth, though ancient sources differ on whether he said anything at all. Some say he simply pulled his toga over his face in dignified silence. When the blood settled, Julius Caesar lay dead at the foot of a statue of Pompey the Great, his old rival. It was an eerie twist of fate. The tyrant had been slain. The Republic had been avenged. Or so the assassins thought. When the bloodied body of Julius Caesar hit the Senate floor, the conspirators believed they had saved the Republic. They expected applause, celebration, a grateful Senate, and maybe a statue or two in their honor. What they got instead was panic. As Caesar's lifeless form lay crumpled beneath the statue of Pompey, the chamber fell into stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Some senators fled in terror, unsure who might be targeted next. Others stayed frozen, unsure whether to mourn or cheer. The assassins, still gripping their daggers, raised bloodied hands and declared they had liberated Rome from tyranny. But outside the chamber, the reaction was far colder and far more dangerous. The Roman people adored Caesar. He was the man who had fed them, entertained them, and promised them land and citizenship. He wasn't just a ruler. He was a populist icon. And now, a gang of elites, many of whom had previously benefited from his rule, had butchered him in broad daylight. There was no trial, no ceremony, just knives and betrayal. The crowd began to grow restless. When the conspirators emerged, expecting cheers, they were met with glares and muttered threats. Even Caesar's enemies didn't quite know how to respond. The Republicans had no clear plan for what came next. There was no successor, no governing council, no roadmap, just a political vacuum. In the hours following the murder, the conspirators retreated to the Capitoline Hill, fearing retaliation. Meanwhile, Mark Antony, Caesar's co-consul and longtime loyalist, moved swiftly to stabilize the situation. Though he had known about tensions, he wasn't part of the conspiracy, and now he held one of the most powerful offices in Rome. Antony brokered an uneasy truce. The Senate would not punish the assassins, and in exchange, Caesar's laws and appointments would remain intact. It was a delicate compromise meant to prevent civil war, but it didn't calm the people. It only delayed the explosion. Caesar's will was unsealed, revealing unexpected news. He had posthumously adopted his grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus, as his heir. And more incendiary still, he had left generous gifts to the Roman citizens. The people were mourning. The assassins had no plan, and two ambitious men, Antony and Octavian, were about to weaponize Caesar's death. The Ides of March had killed a man. But it had awakened something far more dangerous, a power struggle that would tear Rome apart. If Caesar's assassination had stunned the Roman people, his funeral set them ablaze. Just days after the Ides of March, the city gathered in the Forum to mourn their fallen leader. Caesar's body lay in a gilded coffin, draped in purple and gold, displayed in front of Temple of Venus Genetrix, his claimed divine ancestor. Mark Antony, now firmly positioning himself as Caesar's political heir, stepped forward to deliver what would become one of the most famous orations in Roman history. It wasn't subtle. Antony didn't just mourn Caesar. He performed grief. He read aloud Caesar's will to the crowd, revealing that the dictator had left each Roman citizen a generous 300 sesterces and large public gardens from his private estates. The people were stunned. Even in death, Caesar was providing for them. Even in death, he was a man of the people. Then Antony raised the stakes. He lifted Caesar's blood-stained toga, tore it open to display the stab wounds, and pointed to each gash as if reading aloud a charge of treason. Some ancient sources say he even held up Caesar's corpse itself, turning the funeral into a brutal piece of street theatre. The crowd, already angry, became furious. What had begun as a mourning ritual now turned into a full-blown riot. The people rushed through the streets, seized benches and timber from surrounding buildings, and built a makeshift pyre in the Forum itself. As Caesar's body was set ablaze, chaos spread. The crowd turned on the homes of the conspirators, attempting to burn them down. Several were only saved by quick escapes or military protection. Rome was on the verge of civil collapse. The conspirators, now clearly out of favour, realised their worst fear. They had not killed a tyrant, they had martyred a legend. Antony emerged from the funeral as the city's de facto leader, his popularity surging. The Senate wavered, the people raged, and Caesar's young heir, Octavian, was quietly making his way to Rome to claim what had been promised to him. The funeral had not soothed the Republic. It had ignited a firestorm. The Ides of March had been an execution. But the funeral. That was the spark of revolution. Caesar was dead, but his legacy had become immortal. And now it was armed. When Julius Caesar named Gaius Octavius as his adopted son and heir in his will, most people didn't take the teenager seriously. He was just 18 years old, sickly, bookish, and untested. He had no army, no Senate seat, no real political clout. In short, he looked nothing like a threat. But Rome was about to learn that Octavian wasn't just Caesar's namesake. He was Caesar's spiritual successor in every sense. At the time of the assassination, Octavian had been studying in Apollonia, modern-day Albania, preparing to join Caesar on his upcoming Parthian campaign. When news of the murder reached him, he acted with startling speed and clarity. Ignoring advice to stay safe, he sailed straight to Italy and marched toward Rome, not as a general, but as Caesar's son. Not legally yet, but emotionally and politically, he claimed the legacy immediately. Upon arriving in Rome, he began calling himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, emphasizing his connection to the slain dictator. He didn't have power, but he had a name, and in Rome that was enough to make people nervous. Octavian's first step was claiming the 300 million sesterces left by Caesar in the will. Mark Antony, conveniently, was dragging his feet on releasing the funds. The Senate, still shaken by Antony's funeral theatrics, began to see Octavian as a potential counterweight. Octavian, ever the strategist, offered to pay the citizens from his own borrowed money, fulfilling Caesar's promises and winning the public's love. Next, he began courting Caesar's veterans. These were hardened men who had fought across Gaul and in the Civil War. They had adored Caesar, and now they saw his son as the next great hope. Octavian promised them land, money, and revenge. Slowly but surely, his support base grew. Mark Antony, meanwhile, was consolidating power but making enemies, particularly in the Senate. Tensions between Antony and Octavian simmered. It became clear that Rome wasn't big enough for both of Caesar's legacies. The Senate, ever opportunistic, began to shift its favour toward the young Octavian, hoping to use him as a blunt instrument to push Antony back into line. They underestimated him, because Octavian wasn't just a grieving heir. He was a political prodigy, patient, calculating, and utterly ruthless. And while Antony relished drama and spectacle, Octavian preferred quiet deals and long games. The boy no one took seriously was about to redraw the map of power in Rome. As tensions boiled in the aftermath of Caesar's murder, Rome hurtled toward another power reckoning. Mark Antony and Octavian were locked in a cold war, each claiming Caesar's mantle, each gathering armies, and each plotting how to control a republic spiraling into chaos. But neither man could yet go it alone. Enter the forgotten third pillar, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a seasoned general, and Caesar's former master of the horse. While less charismatic than Antony or Octavian, Lepidus still commanded legions and controlled parts of Spain and Gaul. In a moment of uneasy pragmatism, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus struck a political bargain, the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the informal alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus years earlier, this one was official, legally sanctioned by the Senate, and given sweeping powers to restore order. In truth, it was a legalized dictatorship shared between three very ambitious men with wildly different goals. Their first act of business? Revenge. The triumvirs launched a brutal purge of political enemies. They drew up prescription lists, names of senators, equities, and anyone suspected of opposing them. These weren't trials. These were executions. Land was confiscated, families ruined, and blood flowed in the streets of Rome. Even Cicero, the famous orator and outspoken critic of Antony, wasn't spared. Octavian allowed his inclusion on the list, even though Cicero had supported him over Antony. Pragmatism outweighed loyalty. But the real prize was still out of reach, the assassins of Julius Caesar, Brutus, and Cassius. Both had fled east after the murder and were building armies of their own, drawing support from Republican loyalists and provincial governors. The Republic's defenders were preparing for one final stand against Caesar's heirs. In response, the triumvirs began massing their forces. Octavian and Antony marched eastward, leaving Lepidus behind to govern Rome. Their destination? Philippi, in Macedonia. The Republic and the legacy of Caesar were about to collide in full-scale civil war. But already, cracks were showing. The triumvirs were uneasy partners, united only by shared enemies. The moment those enemies were dealt with, everyone knew the knives would come out again. Rome wasn't healing. It was arming for the next round. The Republic was dying, not with legislation or reform, but with swords, alliances, and betrayals. Just as Caesar had warned, the die is cast. In 42 BCE, the fragile Republic faced its final test on the plains of Philippi, in northern Greece. On one side stood Brutus and Cassius, the lead conspirators in Caesar's assassination. They now commanded a combined force of nearly 100,000 troops, backed by Republican senators and provincial allies. On the other side, the forces of the Second Triumvirate, Octavian and Mark Antony, united by vengeance and ambition. The stakes were colossal. This wasn't just about Caesar anymore. It was about the soul of Rome. Cassius and Brutus had the advantage of position and numbers. They fortified high ground and hoped to outlast their enemies. But Antony, the more seasoned general, proved aggressive and clever. On October 3rd, the first engagement broke out. Antony's forces broke through Cassius's lines. Believing Brutus had also lost, Cassius committed suicide on the spot, using the same sword he'd once turned against Caesar. But Brutus held firm for a few weeks longer. On October 23rd, the second battle commenced. Brutus, without Cassius, and now heavily outnumbered, made a final stand. His troops fought valiantly, but Antony's cavalry outflanked them. As his army crumbled, Brutus withdrew, and like his co-conspirator, took his own life. His final words, a mix of regret and duty. Virtue, you were a mere name. The death of Brutus marked the symbolic death of the Roman Republic. The ideal of shared governance, checks and balances, and senatorial rule was buried alongside him. With the victory at Philippi, Antony and Octavian emerged as masters of Rome. But their alliance, already built on necessity more than trust, began to strain immediately. Antony lingered in the east, growing closer to Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Octavian returned to Rome, consolidating his power and framing himself as the defender of Roman values. Back in the capital, Octavian pushed land reforms to satisfy Caesar's veterans, reshaped the Senate, and positioned himself as the calmer, more stable voice in contrast to Antony's exotic escapades. The civil wars were not yet over, but the dream of the old Republic was. The Senate was a ghost of its former self, and political power now belonged to those who commanded armies and loyalty. What began with the murder of one man had unravelled an entire system. The battlefield at Philippi didn't just bury Brutus and Cassius. It buried the Republic itself. With Brutus and Cassius dead and the Republic in ruins, Rome was left in the uneasy hands of two victors, Octavian and Mark Antony. But if history had taught the Romans anything, it was this: power never stays shared for long. At first, the Second Triumvirate limped forward. Octavian ruled the west, Antony controlled the east, and Lepidus was pushed into political irrelevance. The two main rivals pretended at cooperation, but beneath the surface they were manoeuvring for total control. The breaking point came not in Rome, but in Alexandria, Egypt. Antony had become entangled, both politically and romantically, with Cleopatra VII, the powerful and ambitious Queen of Egypt. To many in Rome, this relationship was more than scandalous. It was treasonous. Rumours swirled that Antony intended to divide the Roman Empire among Cleopatra's children, even crown her as Queen of Rome. Whether true or not, Octavian seized the opportunity. He launched a relentless propaganda campaign, portraying Antony as a man seduced by the East, corrupted by luxury, and bent on destroying Roman traditions. Cleopatra was painted as a foreign temptress, manipulating Rome's destiny from afar. The Senate, nervous and eager to side with stability, backed Octavian. In 31 BCE, the two titans clashed at the Battle of Actium, a naval showdown off the western coast of Greece. Octavian's general Agrippa outmaneuvered Antony's fleet. The result? A catastrophic defeat. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where a year later they both committed suicide. The final obstacle was gone. Octavian returned to Rome not just as a victor, but as something new. In 27 BCE, he formally handed back powers to the Senate, only for them to immediately grant him unprecedented authority. He was given the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. It was a masterstroke. He appeared to restore the Republic, all while quietly becoming its emperor in all but name. Thus was born the Roman Empire. Augustus ruled for over 40 years, bringing stability, prosperity, and a carefully curated image of peace. But behind that facade was the truth. The Republic had died with Caesar on the Ides of March. What followed was not rebirth, but transformation. The daggers meant to restore liberty had instead cleared the path for monarchy. Caesar's blood fertilized the soil from which an emperor grew, and Rome would never be the same again. Tokugawa Ieyasu entered the world in 1543 as Matsudaira Takechiyo, a child born into turbulence. Japan was deep in the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, a time when regional lords, or daimyo, vied for dominance in a fractured land. Alliances shifted overnight, betrayal was routine, and bloodshed was business as usual. Born into the Matsudaira clan, a minor noble family based in Mikawa province, young Takechiyo was surrounded by enemies from his first breath. The Matsudaira was squeezed between two powerful and ambitious neighbours, the Oda clan to the west and the Imagawa clan to the east. With no real power to stand alone, Takechiyo's family made the grim decision to secure protection through submission. At just 6 years old, the boy was sent away as a political hostage to the Imagawa, effectively a living pledge of loyalty. But fate twisted cruelly. While en route to the Imagawa court, the Oda intercepted the caravan and took the boy for themselves. For the next 2 years, young Takechiyo lived under the control of Oda Nobuhide, father of the future warlord Oda Nobunaga. Although treated with some care, he was still a prisoner, a bargaining chip. Eventually, after negotiations and trades, he was handed over to Imagawa Yoshimoto, who raised him in Sunpu as a noble hostage. But captivity didn't break Takechiyo, it shaped him. Under the Imagawa, he was educated in classical Chinese texts, martial arts, diplomacy, and the art of war. He was taught how to read people, how to speak with caution, and most importantly, how to wait. While other boys dreamed of glory, he learned the value of patience and positioning. Though he was technically a hostage, he was not forgotten. His father died in 1549, leaving the young boy head of the Matsudaira clan in name, though his autonomy was still years away. Even in his teens, he began to show hints of the man he would become. Quiet, deliberate, always watching. His childhood was not defined by freedom, but by survival. And in an era where the hot-headed were quickly eliminated, that might have been the best training of all. The boy who was passed from hand to hand would one day hold all of Japan in his own. By his early teens, Matsudaira Takechiyo, soon to be known as Tokugawa Ieyasu, was no longer just a pawn in political games. Though still technically a hostage under the Imagawa clan, he had begun to earn respect as a young warrior. He trained relentlessly in swordsmanship, archery, and horseback riding. He studied strategy, court etiquette, and governance. In 1556, at the age of 13, he underwent his coming-of-age ceremony and took the name Matsudaira Motoyasu. With the new name came new responsibilities and the right to lead men into battle. The Imagawa trusted Motoyasu enough to place him in command of small military expeditions. Despite his youth, he displayed an unusual combination of discipline, caution, and calm. He didn't seek glory in reckless charges. He preferred careful planning and decisive action. He was learning the art of war not through legend, but through experience. And in Sengoku, Japan, experience came with blood. In 1557, Motoyasu married the daughter of Sekiguchi Chikanaga, an Imagawa ally, further cementing his bond to the clan. Yet even as he played the loyal retainer, he never forgot his roots. His domain in Mikawa was technically under Imagawa control, but he still had ties to local retainers and vassals who longed for independence. Motoyasu would bide his time, just as he always had. The moment came in 1560, during the Battle of Okehazama. Imagawa Yoshimoto, confident in his growing power, launched an ambitious campaign westward, aiming to conquer Oda territory. The Imagawa army marched with pomp and arrogance, expecting an easy victory. But young Oda Nobunaga, then a relatively unknown warlord, sprung a surprise attack in the midst of a thunderstorm and slaughtered Yoshimoto and his men. The shock was seismic. The Imagawa were decapitated overnight. Their vassals, including Motoyasu, were left leaderless and vulnerable. But instead of panicking, Motoyasu made his move. He seized control of Okazaki Castle, his family's ancestral seat, and quietly declared independence. He returned to Mikawa not as a hostage, but as a rising daimyo in his own right. It was the first real step toward power. He had survived being a hostage, served under a collapsing regime, and now emerged as a player in his own right. The slow, careful climb of Tokugawa Ieyasu had begun. With the fall of the Imagawa clan after the Battle of Okehazama, Matsudaira Motoyasu, now asserting his independence, stood at a dangerous crossroads. His tiny domain in Mikawa was vulnerable to both internal rebellion and larger, hungry neighbours. But he didn't panic. He turned to an unlikely ally, the very man who had just destroyed his former overlord, Oda Nobunaga. In 1561, Motoyasu negotiated a formal alliance with Nobunaga. The terms were simple: mutual military support and recognition of each other's autonomy. As a sign of goodwill, Motoyasu even sent his son, Tokugawa Hidetada, to the Oda court as a political hostage, repeating the painful practice he had endured as a child. It was a reminder of just how fragile and transactional alliances were in Sengoku, Japan. To mark this new chapter in his life, Motoyasu adopted a new name, Tokugawa Ieyasu. The change wasn't just cosmetic, it connected him to an ancient and noble lineage, lending his rule a sense of legitimacy and destiny. It was a calculated move. The Tokugawa name would echo through history, but at this point, it was still an aspiration. Ieyasu spent the next 2 decades building his strength. While Nobunaga expanded rapidly, crushing rival clans and reshaping central Japan with fire and steel, Ieyasu took a more measured approach. He focused on consolidating Mikawa, instituting land reforms, calming rebellious vassals, and modernizing his army. His administration emphasized loyalty, discipline, and slow, steady development. Despite their differences in temperament, Nobunaga was brash and violent, Ieyasu cautious and calculating. The alliance held firm. Ieyasu supported Nobunaga in campaigns against powerful enemies like the Takeda clan, even participating in pivotal battles such as Mikatagahara and Nagashino. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The tension between their ambitions was always bubbling beneath the surface. Nobunaga was a man who devoured rivals and demanded obedience. Ieyasu, on the other hand, was building quietly, waiting for an opportunity to rise on his own terms. That opportunity came in 1582, when Akechi Mitsuhide, a disgruntled vassal, betrayed Nobunaga and forced him to commit suicide during the infamous incident at Honnoji. Nobunaga was gone, and Japan was once again without a central power. Ieyasu didn't rush in. He retreated, reorganized, and watched. The pieces on the board were moving, and he, as always, would wait for the right time to strike. With Oda Nobunaga dead and Japan plunged into uncertainty, the scramble for power resumed. But among all the generals and warlords, one man moved faster and more ruthlessly than the rest, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Within days of Nobunaga's assassination, Hideyoshi avenged his master and swiftly filled the power vacuum, emerging as the new de facto ruler of central Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu, still recovering and consolidating in Mikawa, chose not to challenge Hideyoshi directly. He knew the timing wasn't right. Though he had the strength and the ambition, he lacked the nationwide support needed to take on someone with Hideyoshi's momentum. Instead, he did what he always did best. He adapted. In 1584, tensions between them finally boiled over at the Battle of Komaki and Nagakute. It was one of the few times Ieyasu took a direct military stand against Hideyoshi. While Ieyasu's forces managed a tactical success, the battle ended in a stalemate. Rather than continue the costly conflict, both sides opted for diplomacy. Ieyasu agreed to become a vassal of Hideyoshi in name, but he kept his autonomy. It was a careful balancing act, and Ieyasu pulled it off. Over the next decade, Ieyasu served under Hideyoshi with outward loyalty, but always maintained distance. While Hideyoshi focused on ambitious projects like the Kyushu and Odawara campaigns, and later the disastrous invasions of Korea, Ieyasu quietly strengthened his own position. He expanded his influence into the Kanto region, relocated his base to Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and reorganized his domain into a fortress of future ambition. Ieyasu also kept a close eye on Hideyoshi's succession plans. Hideyoshi had no adult heir, and his young son, Hideyori, was barely a child when born in 1593. Sensing the long game, Ieyasu positioned himself as a stable elder statesman, ready to support the Toyotomi family when the time came. In truth, he was laying the groundwork for a future takeover. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, he left a council of 5 regents to govern until Hideyori came of age. Ieyasu was one of them, and the most powerful by far. He had waited, obeyed, and survived while others flamed out in glory. And now, as the old guard passed into legend, the patient man from Mikawa stood alone among giants, ready to make his move. The final act of unification was near. With Toyotomi Hideyoshi's death in 1598, Japan entered yet another uncertain chapter. His young son, Hideyori, was only 5 years old, and a council of 5 regents, composed of powerful daimyo, had been appointed to safeguard his legacy. But one of them, Tokugawa Ieyasu, had no intention of playing nursemaid to another man's dynasty. Ieyasu wasted no time consolidating power. He strengthened alliances, married off his daughters to key daimyo families, and began openly ignoring the council's decisions. The balance of power shifted, slowly, then suddenly, as more lords began siding with the Tokugawa. Ieyasu wasn't just the most senior of the regents, he was the wealthiest and most politically savvy, and everyone knew it. Meanwhile, opposition gathered behind Ishida Mitsunari, a loyalist to the Toyotomi cause, and a court official with little battlefield experience, but plenty of ambition. Ishida accused Ieyasu of violating Hideyoshi's will, and began rallying daimyo under a banner of defending the Toyotomi legacy. Many of these lords didn't particularly love Hideyori, but they feared Ieyasu more. Lines were drawn. Japan was again hurtling towards civil war. In 1600, Ishida launched a preemptive strike, hoping to crush Tokugawa before he could fully mobilize. Ieyasu, ever patient, had anticipated this. He gathered allies under what would be known as the Eastern Army, while Ishida commanded the Western Army. Nearly 160,000 troops would face off in what would become the largest and most decisive battle in Japanese history. But Ieyasu had one more weapon: deception. He secretly negotiated with daimyo within Ishida's ranks, including Kobayakawa Hideaki, who was promised lands and rewards in exchange for betrayal. On the eve of the conflict, the future of Japan would hinge not just on swords, but on who could be convinced to switch sides at the right moment. As the armies gathered near a foggy crossroads in Sekigahara, few could predict what the next day would bring. For some, it was a final stand for tradition. For others, it was just another civil war. But for Ieyasu, it was the culmination of 6 decades of survival, strategy, and sacrifice. If he won here, the dream he had quietly nurtured since childhood would finally become reality, a Japan united under his rule. On October 21st, 1600, the misty plains of Sekigahara became the stage for the final, thunderous act of Japan's age of civil war. Over 160,000 troops stood arrayed across the battlefield, Tokugawa Ieyasu's eastern army facing off against Ishida Mitsunari's western army. The stakes were nothing less than the future of Japan. Ieyasu, ever the strategist, had positioned his troops with care, anchoring his lines along a ridge and placing trusted allies at key points. But his real plan didn't hinge on tactics alone. He had spent weeks secretly negotiating with several of Ishida's commanders, dangling promises of land and titles. The most important of them all was Kobayakawa Hideaki, whose betrayal would tilt the balance. As the morning fog lifted, volleys of gunfire and arrow showers marked the brutal beginning. The two armies clashed violently, with neither side gaining a clear edge. For hours the battle teetered, blood soaking the fields and samurai clashing in desperate, chaotic duels. Ieyasu remained calm, waiting for the moment he had engineered. That moment came in the early afternoon. Kobayakawa, still perched on the sidelines with thousands of troops, had yet to commit. Ieyasu, frustrated, ordered his musketeers to fire on his position, not as an attack, but as a wake-up call. The message was clear: act now, or be crushed. Kobayakawa made his move. His forces suddenly turned on the Western Army, slamming into the flank of Ishida's men. The effect was immediate and devastating. Panic spread, cohesion broke, and other wavering commanders followed suit. What had been a balanced battle turned into a slaughter. Ishida fled, but was soon captured. Many of his allies were hunted down and executed. Those who survived lost their domains or were forced to submit to Tokugawa authority. The Eastern Army had triumphed, not just by numbers, but through timing, manipulation, and sheer psychological mastery. The victory at Sekigahara wasn't just a military win, it was the final nail in the coffin of the fractured Sengoku era. Ieyasu had eliminated his last major rivals. He didn't just win a battle, he seized control of Japan. Now he didn't have to wait anymore. The throne of power, long contested, was finally his. All that remained was to make it official, and Ieyasu, patient as ever, was ready to shape Japan into something new, under his unshakable rule. Victory at Sekigahara gave Tokugawa Ieyasu control of Japan in practice, but not yet in title. For 2 years, he worked quietly behind the scenes, restructuring power, redistributing fiefs, and rewarding loyalty while punishing defiance. His most dangerous opponents were eliminated. The rest bent the knee. Yet Ieyasu knew that military dominance alone wasn't enough. He needed legitimacy. In 1603, the final reward came. At the age of 60, Ieyasu was officially appointed Sei Taishogun, barbarian subduing great general, by the emperor in Kyoto. It was the same title that Minamoto no Yoritomo had held centuries earlier. But unlike his predecessors, Ieyasu had no intention of stepping down. He had not waited 6 decades to let go now. The Tokugawa shogunate was born. Rather than rule from Kyoto, the symbolic heart of the imperial court, Ieyasu made his capital in Edo, a fishing village he had transformed into a military and administrative hub. Edo, modern-day Tokyo, would become the seat of power for the next 2.5 centuries. Ieyasu wasted no time building an infrastructure of control. He implemented a centralized bureaucracy, placed trusted vassals in key regions, and established a strict social order that locked people into their roles: samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants, with limited mobility. Every class knew its place, and every daimyo knew who was watching. One of Ieyasu's most brilliant policies was the Sankin Kotai system, which required daimyo to spend alternating years in Edo and leave their families behind as virtual hostages when they returned home. It drained their coffers and prevented rebellion, all while boosting the economy through constant travel and infrastructure maintenance. But Ieyasu didn't stop at political and economic reform. He also curbed religion, especially Christianity, which he saw as a destabilizing foreign influence. Missions were expelled, churches destroyed, and persecution began in earnest. Japan would increasingly close itself off to the outside world, just as it was solidifying internal peace. Though officially shogun, Ieyasu would abdicate in 1605, passing the title to his son Hidetada. But the move was symbolic. He remained the true power behind the curtain, ensuring a smooth transition and solidifying Tokugawa dominance. He had waited a lifetime for the throne. Now he ruled from the shadows, with more control than any emperor ever had. The warlord was gone. In his place stood a statesman building an empire. Though Tokugawa Ieyasu had claimed the title of shogun and passed it to his son, one threat still loomed: a child born of the old regime. Toyotomi Hideyori, the son of the late Hideyoshi, had grown into adulthood, and with him a potential rallying point for those still loyal to the Toyotomi legacy. He lived in Osaka Castle, the strongest fortress in Japan, surrounded by a growing circle of discontented ronin, former retainers, and anti-Tokugawa factions. Ieyasu, now in retirement but still the real power behind the shogunate, watched this with deep suspicion. Publicly, Hideyori had done nothing overtly rebellious, but rumours swirled. Disaffected samurai travelled to Osaka. The castle stocked supplies and weapons. Messages to other domains hinted at political manoeuvring. It didn't take much for Ieyasu to decide. Hideyori had to be neutralized, permanently. In 1614, the Tokugawa mobilized an army of over 200,000 troops and surrounded Osaka in what became known as the Winter Campaign. Hideyori, urged by his mother Yodogimi, resisted fiercely. The defenders held, even inflicting damage on the shogunate's forces. Eventually, a peace treaty was brokered. Osaka's moats were to be filled in, and the threat, it seemed, was over. But Ieyasu wasn't finished. In 1615, he found a pretext to resume hostilities, claiming Hideyori had violated the truce by rebuilding defences. The summer campaign began, and this time there would be no truce. Tokugawa forces overwhelmed the castle's outer defences and battered the fortress with cannon fire. In the final battle, Toyotomi Hideyori and his mother committed suicide as Osaka Castle burned around them. The Toyotomi lineage, once dominant, was extinguished in flames. The last serious threat to Tokugawa authority was gone. With the siege's end, Ieyasu's unification of Japan was complete, not just militarily or politically, but symbolically. No more rival heirs, no more lingering loyalties to dead regimes. Just the Tokugawa, standing alone atop the ashes of the Sengoku world. He had outlived his enemies. He had outmaneuvered rivals. And he had buried the last child of chaos beneath the ruins of a fortress once thought impregnable. The lesson was clear. There would be no second act for civil war in Japan. Not while Tokugawa Ieyasu's system endured. In 1616, Tokugawa Ieyasu died at the age of 73. A remarkable age for a man who had survived decades of war, betrayal, and political gamesmanship. But his death didn't bring uncertainty. Quite the opposite. Ieyasu had engineered one of the most stable regimes in Japanese history, and when he passed, the system he built continued to function like a well-oiled machine. His son, Hidetada, had already succeeded him as shogun, and his grandson Ieyasu was being groomed to follow. Unlike the fragile lines of the Minamoto or Ashikaga before him, Ieyasu ensured that the Tokugawa dynasty would survive through institutions, not just personalities. Power wasn't passed with swords anymore. It was passed with rules, alliances, and legacy. Ieyasu's body was buried at Kunozan Toshogu, but later reinterred at Nikko, where he was deified as Tosho Daigongan, the great incarnation of the light of the East. A sprawling, ornate shrine was erected in his honor, becoming one of the most sacred places in all of Japan. He wasn't just remembered as a shogun, he became a god, a symbol of order, longevity, and iron discipline. Under his successors, Japan entered the Edo period, a span of over 250 years of relative peace and stability. Foreign influence was sharply limited. Christianity was outlawed. The country was effectively sealed off in the policy of sakoku, or national isolation. Trade was restricted. Social classes were frozen in place. It was not freedom, but it was peace. The samurai, once fierce warriors, became bureaucrats and administrators. Cities grew, agriculture thrived, and a unique culture of literature, ukiyo-e art, kabuki theatre, and strict etiquette blossomed. Ieyasu had turned a fractured, war-torn nation into a hierarchical, centralized state with a firm grip on every aspect of society. And yet, his greatest legacy may not be the empire he built, but the lesson he taught. Patience wins empires. While Nobunaga ruled with fire and Hideyoshi ruled with charisma, Ieyasu ruled with strategy. He didn't rush, he didn't gamble. He waited, watched, and when the moment came, he struck and never let go. The boy once passed from warlord to warlord as a hostage would become the unchallenged architect of Japan's longest peace. His life was a masterclass in restraint, and his legacy reshaped a nation.